It is very true that we are uncomfortable with sorrow, we are uncomfortable with sadness in our culture. And so I'm so glad that our church has decided to step into the process of helping us deal with grief. And so I've asked Amy Sargent to talk about that and to talk about that process of grief. And Amy, I'm glad that you're here. I know that you're dealing with a lot of different people who are dealing with all sorts of different levels of grief and different types of grief. What are some of those myths that we hear about grief that actually aren't true at all?
Sure. Well, before I get to the myths, and I'll do that, but you said something really poignant, the different types of grief, that I don't think a lot of people understand that there are different types. So there's anticipatory grief, where if you know something's going to happen, the projection of some loved one and their illness and knowing that your time is going to be short with them, then you start grieving that loss already, right? So that's anticipatory grief. There's something called compounded grief, where when you have many, many different kinds of grief happening, like a pandemic that has rocked your world, and then a loss of a loved one or a loss of a job or something, and then more and more of these griefs stack up, then that's called compounded grief. And then there's another type that's called complicated grief, meaning that it's just not it has more intensity around it. It's harder to get through, or maybe you even avoid talking about it. And that is a different kind of grief, or brings up a mixture of a lot of feelings that are not necessarily what people would consider normal. And so that's one thing that I think just a lot of people don't know about. But the myths of grief, again, just very briefly, that it would be that time heals all wounds, which is not true, and that the fact that people who are grieving should be left alone so that they can work through that on their own, that's not true. And then another myth would be that if they are grieving, that they should be going through stages, and that there's a linear pattern of going through the grief process. And that's not true either. There's just a jumble of emotions that you can experience, and you don't have to experience all the different kinds of emotions that another person would.
I love that you mentioned these, because I honestly, just as a moment of vulnerability, I think I've believed, or still kind of halfway believe, all three of those myths. And I've told myself that, like, hey, you're just going through these stages of grief, denial, and anger, whatever. You just got to give it time. No need to talk to anybody about it. So all three of those myths in one, to say you don't need to worry about it. It's gonna be okay. Give it time. So thanks for mentioning that. Instead, is it the opposite? So like it never goes away, and there are no stages, so it's always going to keep going, and we need to always talk about it?
Well, grief is a little bit more like it's almost like a roller coaster, right? Like there's going to be ups, there's going to be downs, there's going to be unexpected things, that twists and turns that you're going to experience. And it's not all predictable, nor is it something that is explainable even for some people, because some people will go through things that other people don't in the grief process. And so it is a very unique process for each individual to have to go through. And each thing that they're grieving will be, like, their process will be commensurate of what they're letting go of, right? So whether that's a loved one or a job or a miscarriage or a friend moving, right? There's going to be all sorts of different kinds of reactions to that. And so you're not going to experience the same kind of grief over one loss as you would another. And so the important part about grief is to acknowledge that loss, and to acknowledge what you're experiencing and what you're feeling, and to be able to work through those emotions and not just avoid them, or not think about them, or busy yourself with all the distractions, which I think a lot of people do, but you end up wanting to move through the grief and honor that loss, pay attention to it, feel it, and then be able to work through it and let it go.
I think you described me a little bit, because I don't want to necessarily feel it. I don't want to talk about it, and I want to minimize it. Plus, I look at the grief of others, and I go, well, my father passed away 5.5 years ago, still haven't dealt with it. I'm going to have to sign up for a grief care class group to start the process based on what you're encouraging me to do. But I remember thinking, well, the man was 70 years old. I mean, that's a full life. There's no need to mourn that, because that's a beautiful end. I mean, it happened very, it was tragic and sudden. But come on, you got to move through that. And the minimizing, I think, is just, I don't know, if you grew up like me, minimizing it's one of my superpowers. I'm able to just put things away, or maybe compartmentalize, or just say life is beautiful. Move along with that. I remember my parents coming into my room as I was laying there crying. I was 14 years old. I had just lost my best friend. She's my cousin, best friend. She died tragically in a car accident. And when you're 14, I mean, those are, core memories. And I remember my parents coming into my room about a week after the funeral saying, "Wait, you're crying? You're still, I mean, I'm laughing about it now, but it's tragic, really. You're still crying." And I thought, yeah, why are we still crying? This is not going to bring her back. Come on, pull yourself together. Here we go. And I tell you that, we all have our history with this and what our parents told us or what our culture teaches us about this issue. And I'm so glad that we as a church get to be honest and say, no, it's time to pause. It's time to process.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most damaging parts of grief is trying to ignore it, trying to push it away. People will just put on that facade of the happy face, pretending like everything's okay. People will ask, "How are you doing?" And you'll be like, "Fine, I'm okay, I'm good," right? But they're not, because inside there's still that pain. There's still that loss. There's still that emptiness. There's still that missing of that person or whatever, again, that loss might be. There's still that sense of a void where something you loved had been. And so when you don't acknowledge that and you try to minimize it or try to cover up that pain, it's telling your body it's not okay to feel this way. Right? Which leads to some sense of shame or feeling of, I should have been able to do something better. I should have been able to get over this already by now. And that shame further harms you. And so that's one of the things, the messages that I'd love to just see us get rid of, right? Like there's no time limit. You can grieve a person for years and years, and it's okay. It's okay to do that because you loved that person significantly.
So what I'm hearing you say is that if we don't do this and walk through this in a healthy way and address our grief and confront our grief or process our grief, that it could have real life consequences
Absolutely.
in our relationships and in our productivity, in our professional life, in our personal life, in our physical well-being. Is that true?
Absolutely, absolutely. I know Again, anytime you bottle up emotions, and this is beyond just grief, if you bottle up anger and don't express it, if you bottle up that sadness, that grief, and don't let it out and talk about it, any kind of unresolved emotional issues that we just push down and not address, not talk about, leads to a lot of health consequences, a lot of emotional health consequences, a lot of relational difficulties. Usually what will happen is that you end up acting it out anyway. So you'll act it out. You'll have more stress in your life. You will have more relational damage that could be inflicted because, again, you are trying not to talk about it or feel it, and so you end up, by that deflection, you put it on to someone else, you put it in a different area. You'll become a workaholic. You might turn towards substances or addictions to kind of numb the pain that you're trying to avoid, right? There's all sorts of different other ways, but physical health issues can certainly come about too. There's higher incidences of heart disease, cancer in people who have different things. There's lots of them. I'm not going to list all of them, but lots of physical health ramifications of unresolved emotional issues.
What a cautionary, important tale of what would happen if we don't deal with our grief. Amy, thank you so much for that. What are some first steps for people that are hearing this?
Yeah, absolutely. The very first step is to acknowledge the loss that you're going through. And I say the loss because it doesn't have to be the loss of a life, of a loved one. It can be any kind of loss again. It's any loss that feels sad. And now a lot of people won't even acknowledge that feeling of sad. And so those are the first steps, right? To acknowledge the loss, to pay attention to it and how it makes you feel. And once you can do that, then there's lots of different ways that you can work through that sadness. Support groups are a wonderful thing. Talking to a friend, being in community, being able to express yourself. Those are wonderful ways that you can work through that and deal with that. Sometimes it's just journaling. If you don't want to go and be vulnerable in front of somebody else, just journal about it, or even make that journal like a prayer about it. But acknowledge that pain. And a lot of times just reading other people's stories about similar griefs can help. And so we have a resource list that's a wonderful opportunity for you to go and find some of those resources as well.
Absolutely. So as you go about your day and this affects you or somebody that's close to you, please visit that website and find all the amazing resources that this team has gathered. And this will help us as we process our grief. Thanks for being here. God bless you.